Chapter 23. The Second Task. Things were chilly at the Slytherin breakfast table, or at least in the little pocket where Violet, Cass, and Tracy sat. Tracy, true to her word, had confronted Cassius about not sharing the egg's riddle with her as soon as he'd solved it, which led to him snapping at her that he'd only just worked it out, that he was very tired, and that she hadn't been very much help in solving it anyways. Violet learned all of this second-hand from Tracy, who woke her very early in the morning by ripping the curtains away from Violet's bed and sitting down on her feet. "Can you believe he actually said that?" Tracy hissed, fuming as she unfastened her sleeping bonnet from around her head. "After all the trouble we've gone through on his behalf," Anthony said, "he didn't even know what I was so mad about because he'd told you about the egg the other night and knew you'd tell me anyhow." Violet, who had an arm thrown over her face in a vain attempt to sleep longer, went rigid. Cash had told her about working out the clue, but he had also told her a lot of other things that night, none of which Violet had yet relayed to Tracy. "But I called him out for trying to use you as cover for his mistake, because you never even mentioned talking to him that night, so I know he was full of it. Honestly, if he would just own up to it and apologize." Tracy, mercifully oblivious to Violet's internal turmoil, went on and on until the rest of the girls in the dorm were up and dressed. By the time she got up, Violet's feet were so numb she didn't even realize she was missing a shoe until she was halfway up the stairs. Now, sitting in the great hall with their plates full of toast and sausages, it was obvious that Tracy's ire had not yet cooled. She was back on Violet's side of the table, for starters, rather than sitting next to Cass, as she'd done for the last several weeks. She also wasn't speaking directly to him, which was a nightmare because she seemed to expect for Violet to do it for her. Only Violet hadn't spoken to Cass at all since their late-night run-in, where he had confessed not only to having feelings for Violet despite his relationship with Tracy, but that he also didn't feel much of anything for Tracy beyond friendship, and was merely pretending to fancy her so as not to hurt her feelings. Violet did not return his feelings and told him so, but she'd not yet managed to find the words to explain it all to Tracy. She would eventually. She had to, because Tracy deserved to know. And Cass must have known what she was thinking, because he kept shooting her furtive, pleading looks at her from across the table whenever Tracy wasn't paying attention. It was enough to drive anyone mad. "I snuck out again last night," Violet muttered when she could stand the awkward silence no longer. Two pairs of eyes snapped to her, distracted from their private little war. "By yourself?" asked Tracy. Violet shook her head. "With Harry." "We needed the cloak." "You told him about the clue," Cass said flatly. He leaned in slightly, dropping his voice low. "Did he, get it?" "Yep," said Violet, not looking at him. "But we saw something funny on the way back. Well, not funny, but odd." Barty Crouch broke into Snape's office. She glanced up at her friends, unsurprised to see the confusion on both their faces. Under the cover of loudly scraping butter across her toast, Violet filled the two of them in on the mysterious events of the night before. "But I thought Crouch was meant to be ill," whispered Tracy. "That's what it said in the papers anyway. He wasn't even here for the Yule Ball, so where'd he get the energy to sneak around the school in the middle of the night?" "And why Snape's office, of all places?" added Cass, frowning. "I mean, what did he expect to find there? Snape doesn't have anything to do with any of this." "He's got to do with something," Violet murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Moody joked about having searched through his office already. "Aura's privilege," he said. "Did he?" said Cass, sounding very surprised. "But Snape's not." "Well, he's a bit of torcer, but I never thought he'd be up to something like that. Not with the way Dumbledore keeps him around, I mean." "That's what Snape said," Violet said, chewing slowly at the crust of her toast. "But apparently Dumbledore's trust doesn't translate to everyone else trusting him, like Moody, and like Mr. Crouch." "He's not a fan of dark wizards either," Cass said, with a very grim edge to his voice. "Ooh, I just had a thought," Tracy squealed, thwacking Violet on the arm for emphasis. "What if Mr. Crouch was here to visit Winky?" "Winky," Cass said. "What's a Winky?" Tracy scowled at him. His house elf. Honestly, Cass, we talked about her loads of times. I can't believe you don't remember or know. Actually, I can believe it, since you don't care about the plight of any oppressed peoples. Merlin's arse, Trace. I've told you 100 times they're not oppressed. They want her work. Their whole life is about serving a household and taking care of the family that lives there. Without pay and without thanks. They get loads of thanks. It's an honor, a mark of status, to be a family that's got ourselves looking after it. A mark of... Tracy stood abruptly, throwing down her knife and fork so loudly that half the dining hall turned round to find the source of commotion. There was a terrible look of rage on her face, and for a moment she swelled, drawing in a deep breath of air to fuel the shout that Violet knew was welling up inside her. But then she stopped, and Violet could see the tears that welled in her eyes just before she turned and ran all the way out into the entrance hall, leaving a very stunned-looking Cass staring after her. Violet was on her feet at once, gathering both her bag and the one Tracy had left behind. When Cass started moving as though he meant to get up as well, she snapped, "Stay here. Haven't you done enough to her?" Cass sat back in his seat with a heavy thud, and Violet raced out of the great hall after Tracy. It wasn't hard to find her. She had only gotten as far as the grand staircase, the steps of which she was sitting on with her fists pressed against her eyes, shoulders heaving from the deep, heavy breaths she took. Violet approached slowly. She sunk down onto the stair beside the shuddering Tracy and gently laid a hand across her back. Tracy raised her head from her hands, and the look of disappointment on her face shot straight to Violet's heart. "Of course it's you," Tracy muttered thickly, sounding very bitter. "For a minute I thought he'd come to apologize, come to his senses, but he doesn't get it, and he probably never will, either. How wrong it is, all of it, but all he can think about is his stupid status, and well, that's just how it's always been, as if that's supposed to make it all make sense. Wizards." She spat the word, as though it left a foul taste in her mouth. "I thought magic was supposed to fix all these problems, but no, it's just the same bollocks all over again, just with stupid hats." Violet, still with her on Tracy's back, didn't know what to say. She knew what Tracy meant. At least, she thought she did. The way wizards talked about house elves sounded awfully similar to the things Uncle Vernon and Aunt Marge would say about people they looked down on, and referred to a backwards time the pair of them longed to return to. And even though Cass wasn't anything at all like Uncle Vernon, it was upsetting, to say the least, that they find common ground on the topic. "He doesn't get it," Violet said softly. "He doesn't get why it bothers you so much. He's probably never had to think about anything like that before in his whole life." "Is that supposed to be an excuse?" Tracy snapped, glaring at her. "He's a big boy. He can start thinking about it now." "No, I know. I didn't mean it like that. Just, well, it's like you said. Wizards. You might have to explain it to him a bit more before he actually gets what the problem is." "I don't want to," Tracy grunted. She pressed her face back into her hands, taking another series of deep, even breaths. "He's been so cross the last few days, and now this. Ah, I don't even want to look at him right now. Damn it, but I left my bag at the table. I've got it here," said Violet quickly, slinging the heavy book bag over her shoulder. Tracy blinked at it as it was passed to her, and the dark look on her face softened ever so slightly. "You're so good, Roman 6. Honestly, you're such a brilliant friend. I don't know what I'd ever do without you." Tracy threw an arm around her shoulders and pulled Violet into a warm, lopsided hug. Their foreheads conked together a little bit, but it was the most wonderful hug in the world, as far as Violet was concerned. "Come on," Tracy said, pulling away as she rose unsteadily to her feet. More people had finished with their breakfast and were beginning to pour out of the great hall. The stairs were no longer an appropriate place to sit, unless one wanted to be kicked or stepped on. "Let's head to Transfiguration. Maybe if we're early, McGonagall will go easy on us." Violet knew this to be about as likely as Hagrid dancing a ballet, but nonetheless took Tracy's offered hand with a smile and followed her up the stairs. Later that same day, during care of magical creatures, Violet was able to reconvene with Harry and his friends. She was eager to hear what sort of solutions they might have come up with for dealing with the task, now that the egg's riddle had been solved. Whether Hagrid was trying to make up for the blast-ended Scroots, or because there were only 2 Scroots left, or because he was trying to prove he could do anything that Professor Grubbly-Plank could, Violet didn't know. But Hagrid had been continuing their lessons on unicorns ever since he'd returned to work. It turned out that Hagrid knew quite as much about unicorns as he did about monsters, thought it was clear that he found their lack of venomous fangs disappointing. Today he had managed to capture 2 unicorn foals. Unlike full-grown unicorns, they were pure gold. The Gryffindor girls Hermione excluded went into transports of delight at the sight of them, and Violet herself was having a hard time keeping herself together. The foals were Sarsoft, and their eyes were so curious, and the way they swished their little tails when spoken to made her heart want to burst with adoration. Easier to spot than the adults, Hagrid told the class. They turn silver when they're about 2 years old, and they grow horns at around 4. Darn go pure white till they're full grown, round about 7. They're a bit more trusting when they're babies. Darn mind boys so much. Come on, move in a bit. Ye can pat 'em if ye want. Give 'em a few these sugar lumps. So excited was she to spend time with the baby unicorns that Violet almost forgot about her brother. When she finally looked around him, she found Harry standing by Hagrid's side, looking uncharacteristically serious. "Yeah, go and win," Hagrid was saying as she approached, patting Harry heavily on his thin shoulder. "I know it. I can feel it. Yeah, go and win, Harry. Hagrid's not the only one who believes in you," Violet said, wandering over now that Harry was alone. "Sounds like you've got it all under control. What's your plan?" The smile on Harry's face dropped immediately now that Hagrid was out of earshot. "There isn't one," he said. "I have no idea what I'm going to do." Violet stared at him in shock. "But then why did you, Harry, don't lie to Hagrid?" "Even it don't lie to Hagrid." I know, I hate it," Harry hissed, turning his back to the rest of the class and scrunching up his shoulders. "But you heard how happy he is for me. How am I supposed to tell him the truth when he looks at me like that?" "You really don't have any ideas," Violet said. "Ron wants me to summon a pair of aqualungs from the nearest Muggle town," Harry said, his ears going faintly pink as he spoke. "And Hermione thinks it would be neat if I could turn myself into a submarine." So no, Roman 6 no ideas. Only a lifetime of practice keeping a straight face in front of the Dursleys saved Violet from laughing out loud, right in her brother's face. "Where did Ron learn about aqualungs?" she asked, stalling for time to further school her expression. "I told him," said Harry glumly. "I bet it would work, too. Only getting them all the way to Hogwarts without being seen would never work. There's too much open countryside. And you don't know how to use them. And I don't know how to use them." Harry shot her a look of annoyance. "Haven't you got any ideas then? What's Cassius doing about having to breathe underwater for an hour?" "Dunno," Violet shrugged. "You don't know? I thought you were helping him too." "I was." She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, only for a gust of wind to pull it right back out again. "But he's being a prat to Tracy, so now I'm not." "Oh," Harry said. He frowned down at the soft, muddy ground that the 2 of them were slowly sinking into. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, "Are you really going out with George Weasley?" "Wah!" Violet turned her head sharply just as another gust of wind rushed across the ground, blowing an awful lot of her own hair straight into her mouth. Harry kept talking as she struggled to clear it out. "When you went to the ball together, I figured it made sense since you know him, and he was a safer choice than just some random boy, but you're still. I mean, I guess it's obvious with all the kissing." He scrunched up his nose. "I dunno, I just figured I should ask." "Oh," Violet said softly. I think so. We haven't really talked about it like that, but yeah, we kiss and stuff." Harry's head snapped toward her, his expression somewhere between fury and revulsion. "Stuff like holding hands, spending time together," Violet clarified quickly. Her face was burning so hot she thought her skin might catch fire. We go on walks around Hogsmeade, and he and Fred show me some of the funny snacks and tricks they're working on, that's it. And that's good, Harry asked abruptly. I mean, he huffed, screwing up his face as though trying to come up with the right words. It was a look Violet was very familiar with. Harry usually just blurted the first though that came into his mind, fully formed or not. So when he took the time to actually think about what he was saying, she knew it was something important. But before he could get it out, there was a commotion from the paddock behind them, a shriek, followed by loud pals of laughter. Violet and Harry both whipped around in time to see Crabbe struggling to his feet, mud all over his robes, as one of the unicorn foals brayed angrily in his direction. I warned ye, Hagrid called, shaking his great hairy head as he strode toward the foal. Wha did ye think would happen, ye greer lump? Harry and Violet exchanged a look and found a matching grin on each other's faces. Violet gave her brother a quick nudge on the arm, and the pair of them headed back toward the rest of the class. The week leading up to the second task seemed to crawl by, as though all the clocks had been set to move at half speed sometime when Violet wasn't looking. It wasn't that classes had become more difficult or less interesting, only that every hour spent learning how to blast cushions across the room or turn a walnut into a wind-up toy Violet felt as though she should be doing something more. Hera still hadn't worked out a solution for spending an hour underwater, which she knew because every time they saw each other he would avoid her gaze, shake his head, and very quickly move in the opposite direction. With the exception of yesterday, Harry pulled her aside on their way out of potions class, and in a feverish sort of whisper, asked her to swap clothes with him and undertake the challenge on his behalf. Violet very apologetically reminded him not that they hadn't gotten away with that trick since they were about 8 years old, but she also didn't have a clue about breathing underwater either. Harry had given her such a look of despair that she almost changed her mind and agreed, just on principle. But thankfully, he'd turned and walked away before Violet could get herself into trouble making promises she couldn't keep. She could ask Cass for help, she supposed, if only she were on speaking terms with him. The argument over breakfast had put both him and Tracy into lingering foul moods. Cass had yet to apologize or even try to understand where he'd gone wrong, and Tracy was doing an excellent job of pretending he didn't exist. She and Violet sat by themselves at meal times and huddled away in the comfort of the girls' dormitory rather than studying out in the Slytherin common room. If Cass was struggling with the coming task as Harry was, he didn't confide in them even that. Violet had seen him in the company of other students in his year, huddled and gesturing frantically to one another. She had also seen him looking at her from across rooms and hallways, even if he quickly turned away whenever she bravely looked back. Tracy still hadn't been told the truth. It was eating Violet up inside, but somehow the idea of kicking her best friend while she was down didn't sit right. Maybe this rift between her and Cass would grow, and they would break up on their own, and then Violet wouldn't, Vito, have any more uncomfortable conversations with either of them. She didn't like to think what sort of state a breakup might leave their friendship in, however, because despite all the awkwardness and deceit and confusion between them, Violet still cared for Cass very much. They had been friends since her first year at Hogwarts, when he'd stopped her from running off and getting herself killed by a troll. He'd stood up for her against Malfoy and had tutored her in charms at Professor Flitwick's request. Year after year, he'd been a staunch friend to both her and Tracy until all this romance business got in the way, at least. Violet almost wished that the Yule Ball had never happened, and none of those awful, uncomfortable feelings she had ever gotten the opportunity to be spoken aloud. But she reflected that without the ball, she might never have gotten the chance to know George. With the full moon making an appearance the night before, the day's Beasts and Beings lesson was put on hold, leaving Violet with an unexpected free period. She had time to do something that had been in the back of her mind for the better part of a week, but with no time to actually go and do it. Return to the kitchens and visit Winky the house elf. She tried to get Tracy to come with her one evening, but with the conflict with Cass so fresh in her mind, The other girl apologetically declined to come along. Violet supposed she could go by herself, but in her experience, mischief was much more fun when got into it with someone else. "Hey," she called, jogging up behind a pair of familiar red-haired boys, both of whom looked around at the sound of her voice. "Hey yourself," said Fred and George in unison, grinning identically at her. "Are you busy?" Violet asked. The Weasley twins looked at each other. "On our way to Transfiguration," said Fred. "So, not really," said George. "Where are you off to?" "The kitchens," Violet said quietly, glancing around at the other students moving through the halls around them. Lee Jordan, the twins' best friend, was lingering further up the passageway, but nobody else seemed to be paying them any mind. "I wanted to know if you'd come along, but if you're going to miss class—" "Ah, McGonagall won't mind," said Fred, waving a hand dismissively. "She's got a soft spot for us. At least we think so," said George. "We haven't been expelled yet, so that's proof enough. Course we'll come along." "Oh," said Violet, suddenly feeling very awkward. Actually, I just wanted to bring George." I mean, her cheeks had gone very hot again, and the smile had fallen slightly from Fred's face as she spoke. "Oh, right, yeah, of course," he said, recovering quickly. "Hear that, Georgie?" he said, nudging his twin in the ribs with the point of his elbow. "You're needed for a solo mission." "Reckon you can handle it?" George, whose neck had gone very pink, elbowed his brother right back. "Yeah, I reckon," he said. He grinned, looking suddenly shy, and Violet thought her face might melt clean off of her skull. "You go on, then," George said, giving Fred a little shove in Lee's direction. "We'll, catch up later." Then he took Violet's hand in his, and the pair of them headed off. "What's the plan in the kitchens?" George asked her when they were halfway down the stairs to the dungeons. "Got a craving, or are you planning to try and slip something into Malfoy's supper? If so, I have to warn you the elves darn like it when you try to tamper with the food." "It's nothing like that," Violet giggled. She always found herself giggling around George and didn't know quite how to make herself stop. "Though now that you've given me the idea, I might have to give it a try sometime. But actually, I wanted to visit Winky again." "Barty Crouch's old house elf," George said, drawing up short. "What for?" "I want to know if she's seen Mr. Crouch lately, or at least heard from him," Violet said. She gave George a brief rundown of last week's events, seeing Crouch on the map, the strange standoff between Professor Snape and Mad-Eye Moody. She omitted the fact that she'd let Moody take the map, an action she was sorely regretting as the two of them crept around corners, listening out for Filch or any stray Hufflepuffs that might be wandering around by the kitchens. "So Moody thinks Snape's on his second chance," George said when she was through, looking very interested in it all. "If that's true, I wonder what he did with his first one." "That's what I said, too." As soon as the door to the kitchens opened, Violet and George found themselves once again surrounded by cheery house elves, bowing and curtsying and bustling around making tea again. Darby appeared in front of them almost at once, shaking Violet's hand excitedly. "Violet Potter is most welcome in the kitchens," he squeaked, hopping from one foot to another as his bat-like ears flopped around his head. "Darby is hoping to see her and Harry Potter again, but Darby is too busy working to come and see them." "What do you do on your days off?" Violet asked. A silver tray of muffins appeared beside her, supported by 4 house elves, and she very gratefully took one despite the fact she'd just come from lunch. "Darby works, miss," he said, smiling sheepishly. "But he works because Huansto, not because he must." "Good to have the option, I suppose," said George, and Darby nodded emphatically at him. "Yes, sir, Darby thinks so too." "Darby, do you know George?" Violet asked. "He's my friend." Darby nodded again. "Darby has seen him in the kitchens, miss, but Darby is not introducing himself." "George Weasley," said George, sticking out his hand, which Darby graciously shook while staring up at him with wide, wet eyes. "Pleasure to officially meet you, Darby." "Harry's talked about you loads." "Sir is a Wheezy," squeaked Darby, hopping again. "Like Harry Potter's Wheezy, Violet Potter has her own Wheezy too." "Oh, yeah." Violet stammered, smiling sidelong at George, who she was pleased to find grinning from ear to ear at her. Listen, Darby, I know you're all very busy, and I don't want to be in the way, but is Winky still here? I was hoping to talk to her again. Winky is over there by the fire, miss, said Darby quietly, his ears drooping slightly. Oh dear, said George as he spotted Winky. Violet looked over at the fireplace too. Winky was sitting on the same stool as last time, but she allowed herself to become so filthy that she was not immediately distinguishable from the smoke-blackened brick behind her. Her clothes were ragged and unwashed. She was clutching a bottle of butterbeer and swaying slightly on her stool, staring into the fire. As they watched her, she gave an enormous hiccup. Winky is getting through 4 bottles a day now, Darby whispered to Violet. But it's not very strong, is it? Violet said. Darby shook his head. Tea's strong for a house elf, miss, he said. Winky hiccuped again. The elves who had brought the muffins gave her disapproving looks as they returned to work. George gave Violet a quick look before wandering after them, giving her a moment to speak to Darby alone. Winky is pining, Violet Potter, Darby whispered sadly. Winky wants to go home. Winky still thinks Mr. Crouch is her master, miss, and nothing Darby says will persuade her that Professor Dumbledore is her master now. Has Mr. Crouch been to visit her lately? Violet asked. No, miss. Nobody is visiting Winky besides Darby, said Darby sadly. Winky hiccuped again, this time so hard she almost fell off of her stool. She wobbled, flailing an arm out to the side before settling. People are saying Mr. Crouch is ill, Violet said in a low voice, crouching down so that only Darby could hear. It's in the papers, and he wasn't at the Yule ball with the other judges. But I know at least, Ithink was in the castle a few days ago, in the middle of the night. I suppose I thought he might have come down to check on Winky while he was here. Darby's eyes had gone very wide. Violet Potter mustn't tell Winky that Mr. Crouch is unwell, he whispered desperately. Winky will start blaming herself. Winky will think it is her fault, miss. But of course it's not her fault. He sent her away. How could she blame? Winky is a good house elf, Darby said, sounding slightly guilty as he turned in Winky's direction. Winky is not like Darby, miss. Winky cares about her master and misses him terribly. His little shoulders went suddenly tense, quivering slightly as though he were trying to hold very still. Violet, who had once seen Darby try to bludgeon himself unconscious with a table lamp, just for alluding that the Malfoys, the family that had once owned him, were not very nice people, quickly put a steadying hand on his back. I think you're a wonderful house elf, Darby, Violet said, smiling encouragingly at him. The best I've ever known. Darby's shaking intensified. He looked up at Violet with tears leaking from his enormous green eyes. Violet Potter is most kind to Darby, he warbled. If there is ever anything Darby can do to repay her, actually, a thought had just popped into Violet's head. Darby, house elves have their own way of doing magic, right? Do you know a way to stop someone from breathing? Darby's already overlarge eyes widened even further, and Violet worried for a moment they might fall right out of his head. Stop someone from having to breathe, I mean, she corrected. Like, so you can swim without drowning or something. Harry's got to find a way to survive the next task in the tournament, but I don't think he's come up with anything yet. I'm sorry, miss, Darby said, heaving a great sigh of relief. The magic of the house elves is not like wand magic, but there are things even we can't do. But if Harry Potter is in need of help, then Darby will find a way to help him. Darby swears it on his life. Oh, that's all right, Darby. Violet suddenly remembered the last time Darby had tried to help her and Harry. He'll think of something in time. I know he will. After bidding Darby goodbye, Violet and George found themselves leaving the kitchens with 2 muffins, an eclair, a ham sandwich, and a wedge of gooseberry pie each, waved fondly away by a crowd of smiling house elves. They stood outside the kitchen doors, fumbling with their armloads of food. What did Winky have to say? George asked around a large mouthful of pie as they began to walk back toward the staircase. Nothing. I didn't even talk to her, said Violet. But I got what I needed to know from Darby Crouch hasn't been to see her. so there's no reason for him to have even been in the castle that night. Blimey, but I wonder what he was looking for in Snape's office. Me and Fred have broken in loads of times, but it's all just bottles of pickled dragon warts and basilisk brains. He was joking, but Violet knew that Professor Snape did, in fact, have a jar of basilisk brains sitting on a shelf behind his desk. "Thanks for coming with me," she said, "even if it wasn't as fun as you thought it would be." George looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Are you joking? It was fun just getting to spend time with you. And we got pie." Violet giggled again. There was a funny sort of flutter in her chest, like a butterfly was trying to flap its way out from behind her ribcage. Halfway up the staircase she stopped, her foot hovering over the stone step, and asked, "George, are we boyfriends?" George, who was also mid-step, tripped and had to juggle to keep hold of his muffins and sandwich. As soon as Violet realized what she'd said, she wanted to die. "Oh no." She moaned. She wanted to cover her face with her hands, but the muffins. "That's not what I meant. I can't believe I said that." There was a funny noise coming from the stairwell, and it took her a moment to realize that it was coming from George, doubled over and wheezing with laughter. "It's not funny," Violet said, suddenly indignant. "I was trying to ask. I'm so stupid. I shouldn't have even said anything." Tears of embarrassment were pricking at the corners of her eyes as Violet tried to rush up the stairs, only to be stopped by George's arms wrapping around her middle, dropping all their food in the process. Violet gasped as he pulled her around to face him, a great smile on his freckled face. "I know what you meant, Roman 6, he said softly. His brown eyes were glittering with laughter still, but it wasn't at all mocking like she'd feared. Violet stared at him, melting slightly into his grip. "I'd love to be your boyfriend." "Really?" Violet asked, suddenly breathless. George nodded, and his expression turned serious. "But," he said gravely, "only if you want to be my boyfriend too." "You're ridiculous," Violet said, and kissed him. When he kissed her back, smiling against her mouth as he did, the lone butterfly in her chest erupted into a swarm, beating their wings like a hurricane inside her. His lips tasted sweet from the pie, and she felt breathless, weightless maybe, because George had actually lifted her an inch or so above the ground. All that so that he could hold her closer to him. It was impossible to say exactly how much time had passed by the time they finally parted, but the bell ringing from high overhead meant that they couldn't stay there for much longer. Both of them breathless and pink in the face, George and Violet hurriedly gathered up their spoils from the kitchens and hurried up the stairs out of the dungeons, only to run almost headlong straight into Professor McGonagall, who was on her way into the staff room just as the pair of them reached the top step. "Mr. Weasley," she called sternly, and Violet felt her stomach drop into her shoes. "Shit," George said under his breath as McGonagall made her way toward them. Violet quickly tucked a muffin under each armpit, desperate to appear normal. "I was informed by the other Mr. Weasley that you had taken ill," Professor McGonagall started, her lips thinning as she looked down her nose at George. "That you were, in fact, laying in the hospital wing as though on your deathbed after falling afoul of a malicious hex on your way out of the toilets." "Ah, good old Fred," said George, who was trying to casually hide a ham sandwich behind his back. "You know how he likes to exaggerate, doesn't he just?" said McGonagall, her eyes flashing. "5 points from Gryffindor for your unexcused absence and for trespassing in the kitchens." "And you, Miss Potter?" "I had a free period, ma'am," Violet said quickly. "I didn't skip anything." But Professor McGonagall was looking at her very intently, her mouth going thinner and thinner as she glanced between George and Violet. Violet became horrifically aware of what it must look like, the two of them coming out of the dungeons, alone, hair tousled, and sheepish smiles on their blushing faces. She wondered briefly if pitching herself backwards down the stairs would be enough to kill her outright, or if it would merely stun her. "Off with you then, Potter," said McGonagall after a moment. "And do consider using your free time more productively in the future." "Yes, Professor," Violet managed to squeak out. She didn't dare look back at George as she scampered away, moving as fast as her legs could go without breaking into a run. It was the afternoon before the second task, and the halls of Hogwarts were all aflutter with predictions about the upcoming event. Only the 4 champions were meant to know the details of the clue contained by the golden egg, but word had gotten around that it was going to have something to do with the lake, and quite a lot of people were determined to guess. I bet they've got to walk across it. Don't be stupid, Michael, that's too easy. I think they'll have to drink it until it's empty, and whoever swallows the most water wins. But it's February. Everyone but Crummel freeze to death. I bet they planned this. I don't trust those foreigners not to cheat, you know. Everywhere she went, Violet heard one cockamamie theory after another. Nobody seemed to think that having to dive in and find a treasure would be a challenge enough. But after yet another panicked conversation with her brother, Violet was beginning to think the task he'd been set was impossible. Hermione's suggesting of turning into a submarine was sounding more plausible by the hour. There had to be a way for a person to breathe underwater for an hour, and all of the other champions must have found it already since none of them were running around like chickens with their heads cut off. Not even Cass, who had spent the last evening playing Exploding Snap in front of the fire with Adrian Pusey and Graham Montague. With her brother's life in mortal peril, Violet was finding it hard to keep her resolve not to talk to him. A tentative truce had been reached between Tracy and Cass, at last. He'd waited for her outside the girls' dormitory, a single yellow rose and a box of Honeydukes chocolates in his hands, and very sweetly apologized for disregarding Tracy's feelings. It wasn't exactly what Tracy wanted. Violet knew Schuentedkus to change his mind about house elves and see the bigger picture of it all, but it was enough of a gesture to get her to speak to him again. She very quietly thanked him and accepted the gifts, but she also declined the hug he offered afterwards. They parted with a cordial handshake and once more sat next to one another during meals, even if they didn't talk very much. If they were talking and everything had gone back to the normal, maybe Violet would have been able to justify going up to Cass and asking what he planned to do about the task. But the way things stood currently, she just couldn't bring herself to do it. "Here," said Tracy, startling Violet, as she dumped an armload of books onto the table between them. "You take half of these, and I'll take the other." They were in the library again, but this time with an actual goal in mind. Professor Binns had set another essay on goblin treaties, due at the end of the week. But none of the titles Tracy had picked out seemed to have anything to do with goblins as far as Violet could tell. "Wandering Hill's Other Forbidden Delicacies," Violet read aloud, looking at the title that had landed face up in front of her. "Is this a cookbook? Last-ditch effort," Tracy said, huffing slightly as she threw herself down into her chair, "to find something that will help Harry out." "But these don't have anything to do with being underwater," said Violet, as she looked through the tomes that Tracy had collected, one of which was a copy off-getting with Goolsby Gilderoy Lockhart, their former defense against the dark arts teacher. "Did you just grab these at random?" "Not random," said Tracy haughtily. "I knocked these 2 over by mistake, and this one I nicked off Longbottom since he was coming to hand it in anyways. Come on, Violet. We've already tried all the obvious places, haven't we? Might as well see what's left." Privately, Violet didn't think that they stood any chance at all of finding answers in a cookbook, but she was tired enough of noting down every time a wizard prime minister had ever broken a promise to the goblins to try anything else. She flipped the cookbook open and to read. She had only made it halfway through the ingredient list for ashwanda frittatas when Tracy gasped. "You're joking," she muttered, staring wide-eyed at the open page in front of her. "I mean, you've got to be kidding me." "What?" Violet said eagerly. "Did you really find something?" Wordlessly, Tracy picked up the book in front of her and showed Violet the cover, which was a muddy sort of brown, and had the title Magical Water Plants of the Mediterranean stamped across the cover in bold block letters. "First bloody page I opened to," Tracy said, sounding mystified as she passed the book across the table. "Look." Violet's eyes raced over the page that Tracy indicated, scanning the illustration, a tangle of gnarled roots that looked more like living worms than plant matter, and read the passage. 3 sentences in, her mouth fell open. Identifiable by its slender, shiny leaves and bundle of writhing roots, gillyweed is a magical plant native to the warm waters of the Mediterranean Sea. Though discovered in 1843 by renowned herbologist Beaumont Marjoribanks, the magical properties of gillyweed remained unknown until Elidora Ketteridge ate the plant and nearly suffocated, recovering only when she stuck her head in a bucket of water. When ingested by a human, the plant allows the consumer to breathe and move underwater with ease, granting them not only gills, but elongated webbing on their hands and feet so that they may. Violet slammed the book shut. A moment later she opened it, breathing very heavily, and then closed it once again, staring across the table into Tracy's bewildered eyes. "This can't be real. It's ridiculous," Tracy hissed. "You've been looking for some spell or charm or potion recipe, and it turns out there's just a random plant that turns you into half a fish. How insane is that?" "Keep reading. It says they make a tonic out of it that you can just go out and buy. We've probably walked right past it in Hogsmeade and Diagon Alley, and who knows where else. They could sell it at Tesco's, for all I know. Wizards." "I have walked past gillyweed before," Violet said, satisfaction welling up alongside the disbelief still bubbling inside her. "Or at least I've seen it before, and I know where to get it." "What? Where?" "Professor Snape's got some. It was mixed in with a bunch of other ingredients he brought out to test me on during," she dropped her voice to a whisper, leaning close across the table, "during one of my lessons last year. I didn't use it. It was one of them that he mixed in there to trip me up, but I remember seeing the name on the label. Inno's got it, Tracy." "Well then, let's go ask him for it," Tracy said, jumping up from her seat with gusto. Violet's eyes widened. "Are you mad? He'd never just give it to us, especially not without explaining what we wanted it for. And if he knew it was to help Harry, well, I bet he'd eat it himself before letting that happen," Tracy said grimly, sitting down once more. "I see your point." The two girls sat in silence, frowning at the open book in front of them. All the answers laid out right there, so close and yet so far away. After a moment, Violet looked up and found Tracy's eyes. Her mind was set, and something of that determination must have shown on her face. "You want to break into Snape's office and get it, don't you?" Tracy murmured, frowning. "Yep. Do I have to come with you to do it?" "Not if you don't want to," Violet assured her gently. "But Yawareth wanted to find out what we needed, Trace, and I could use someone to stand lookout for me." Tracy gnawed on her bottom lip. She glanced nervously around them, as though Professor Snape might be lurking behind a bookcase and eavesdropping on their plans, before heaving a heavy sigh. "All right, Roman 6, she said. "I'll help you out this time for Harry." "For Harry," Violet agreed, grinning. They waited until dinner, when the evening meal was in full swing and everyone on the staff was sure to be in attendance, before creeping their way down into the dungeons. They didn't veto sneak in this particular portion of the halls as Slytherins. They had more right than anybody to be wandering around random dungeon passages, but Tracy's nervous excitement made it seem like every step was a risk, and every turn they took might lead them into danger. The last and only time that Violet had seen gillyweed, it was in a squat little glass jar with a wide cork stopper in the top of it, being sorted back into a crate of potion ingredients by Professor Snape's pale hands. He'd collected it along with a host of other seemingly random ingredients from the cupboard in the back of his office, which he'd then set in front of Violet and ordered her to prepare a befuddlement draft from memory. There were many more ingredients than were necessary for the potion to choose from, but Violet successfully avoided the traps he had set for her, one of which was the unfamiliar jar of gillyweed. "Okay," Violet whispered as they stopped outside the large, heavy wooden door of Professor Snape's office. "I'll stand guard," said Tracy, sounding very anxious now that they were in sight of their target. Just hurry, Violet, okay? I'll be quick, I promise." "Snape's really organized," so it shouldn't be hard to find. Violet untied the thick leather cord she often wore hidden under her shirt. Affixed to it was a charm of polished bone that Hagrid had gifted her for her very first Christmas at Hogwarts, which was very dear to her. But Violet also used the cord to hold something much more helpful, a ring, gleaming silver, and set with 3 small, milk-white stones. This she slipped onto her pointer finger and used to walk straight through the solid wood of the door. She emerged into the familiar office space and immediately froze, waiting. She half expected an alarm to go off or a trap to spring, alerting Professor Snape and Filch and Professor Dumbledore or whoever else to come and punish her. After all, Snape's office had only recently been trespassed. It seemed unlikely that no extra security would have been added. But after 30 seconds of standing and holding her breath, waiting for something to happen to her, Violet relaxed. She recalled Professor Snape telling Moody that he sealed the door to his office with a charm. As Violet had simply gone through the door rather than opened it, perhaps the protective charm hadn't triggered. She stepped softly further into the room, her nervous form reflected in the many jars and bottles that filled the shelves on the back wall. They glittered in the light as Violet lit her wand to see better. None of these were her target, she knew. The pickled specimens were far too large, and she couldn't remember ever seeing Professor Snape actually use any of them during her private brewing lessons. No, what Violet was after was the tall, closed cabinet in the corner where all of the practical ingredients were kept. The wooden doors of the cupboard opened soundlessly for her, and Violet's eyes quickly began darting over the collection of containers. Some looked very old, coated in dust and cobwebs as though they hadn't been moved for a decade, and others were obviously brewed and placed so recently that Violet could see thumbprints still on the glass. She turned her head sideways, squinting to try and read the little paper labels covered in Snape's cramped scrawl. Eek, she murmured to herself, glancing over the bottle's labeled elixir, euphoriandarumpant horn powdered. F, G, okay, gillyweed, where are you, gillyweed? Her eyes swept the shelf once, twice, then a third time. With each look, the sinking feeling in her belly further compounded itself. It wasn't there. There was a gap right between 2 dusty old bottles, just wide enough to fit a third between them. But instead of a bottle or jar or phial of any kind, there was only a ring of dust in the shape of something Thatu said to be there, but was no longer. Tracy let out a startled squeak as Violet stepped back through the door, appearing right next to her. It's not there, Tracy swore loudly. What do you mean it's not there? Are you sure you were looking in the right place? I know exactly what I was looking for, Violet snapped, her form solidifying as she yanked the ring off her finger. It was there, but it's not anymore. Maybe somebody else got to it first, Tracy muttered as they hurried back down the passageway, putting distance between themselves and the office door before anybody could come along and catch them lingering. Or maybe Snape moved it somewhere else. Do you want to try the classroom next? Supper's not over for another, Potter. Davis. Rounding the corner ahead of them was the familiar face of Zoe Crington, one of the Slytherin prefects. She hurried over to where Violet and Tracy stood frozen, clutching one another's hands in shock. Were they caught? I've been looking everywhere for you two, Zoe said, sounding slightly out of breath. She was smiling, which seemed to be a good sign. What for? Violet asked nervously. Professor McGonagall wants a word. Don't worry, you're not in trouble, she added, seeing their stricken expressions. But her eyes narrowed suddenly as she observed their guilty faces. Not yet, anyways. Just what are you two getting up to down here? Nothing you can prove, Tracy said boldly. To Violet's immense relief, Zoe threw her head back and laughed. Yeah, all right. Come on, follow me. I want to get back in time for pudding. Frustrated and bewildered, Violet and Tracy dutifully trudged along after Zoe until they ended up outside the door to McGonagall's office, where they were surprised to find they were not the only ones to have been summoned. Hermione was standing in front of McGonagall's desk next to a little blonde girl who looked no older than 8, dressed in the colors of the Beauxbatons uniform. She looked striking similar to Fleur de Lacre. Beyond them stood not only Professor McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey, both of whom were looking rather grim, but also the smiling, boyish face of Ludo Bagman. "Ah, there you both are. Thank you, Miss Accrington. That will be all," said McGonagall, nodding in response to Zoe's curious stare. The door closed, and Tracy and Violet were beckoned to stand alongside the other girls. "Hello there, Violet," said Bagman, his eyes alighting on her. "Lovely to see you again, dear girl." "Hello, sir," said Violet, who had only spoken to Mr. Bagman once before, when they were briefly introduced at the Quidditch World Cup. She looked to Professor McGonagall. What's going on?" "I'll start by saying that none of you are in trouble," she said, and the air in the room immediately relaxed, if only slightly. "You young ladies have been summoned in regards to the Triwizard Tournament and your connection to its champions." Violet's tummy did another funny wobble. Was this because they were helping the champions? McGonagall said they weren't in trouble, but then what else for the second task? Started Bagman. "Each of the 4 champions has been given a time limit and tasked with the recovery of something, precious that has been stolen from them." His cheerful smile widened at them rather pointedly. The 4 girls looked around at each other, eyes widening. "Us!" exclaimed Hermione, looking dumbstruck. "With a thing they'll sorely miss." "Oh," she clapped a hand over her mouth, realizing too late that she'd revealed her knowledge of the secret clue. Professor McGonagall gave her a piercing look, but Bagman only chuckled. "So you are, my dear. Now, to be clear, none of you are actually being stolen away into the night, never to be heard from again should your champion fail to recover you. That's all just a bit of flowery language to get them all riled up. Our champions," Violet said hesitantly. "Meaning?" "We've got to be found by a specific one." "That's the ticket," said Bagman. "One precious treasure per champion. You'll belong to your brother, of course, and you to your sister, Miss de Lacre." He nodded kindly to the Beauxbatons girl. "Miss Davis, you'll go to Mr. Warrington, and Miss Granger is for Mr. Crumb." Both Tracy and Hermione let out a pair of strained, painful-sounding squawks. Tracy's cheeks had gone even darker than usual, and Hermione looked as though she meant to protest. The little de Lacre girl, Fleur's sister, apparently now looked extremely nervous, but a strange calm had settled over Violet, evening out the unease that had been building since she entered the office. If Harry was supposed to come and rescue her, then he would. She knew without a single shadow of a doubt that no matter what the challenge, no matter what obstacles had been set against him, that Harry would find a way to get to her and bring her to safety. He'd been protecting her all their lives, after all. But without the gillyweed, she still had no idea how it was going to do that. "But I'm afraid there is some risk to your role," Professor McGonagall, still looking very grim in contrast to Bagman's excitement. "Madame Pomfrey and myself will be taking every precaution in your preparation and placement, and Professor Dumbledore himself has negotiated your potential recovery." "Recovery from where?" Tracy blurted, looking rather terrified. McGonagall's expression softened slightly. "Forgive me, Miss Davis. I got rather ahead of myself. For your part in this task, you are required to undergo the effects of a powerful charm. You will be rendered unconscious, though your vital functions shall be carefully preserved and maintained. The 4 of you will be transported to the Black Lake, where the second task will be taking place tomorrow morning, and carefully put into place beneath the water to await recovery by your champion. I will be placing the charm upon you myself," Professor McGonagall said, as though sensing the sudden spike of anxiety that had surely gone through each of the girls. "And Madame Pomfrey will monitor you all through the night, until it is time to be placed. While I cannot guarantee that no harm will come to you, given the extremely dangerous nature of this task," she shot a disapproving look at Ludo Bagman, "I can assure you that you are in the very best of hands, and will feel no pain or discomfort under the effects of the stasis charm. It will simply feel as though you have drifted into a dreamless sleep, and the spell will be broken once you arrive back to safety. Now, are there any questions?" Violet, Tracy, Hermione, and Fleur's sister all looked around at each other, waiting to see if anyone was going to speak up. When none of them did, Madame Pomfrey clapped her hands together and stepped forward. "All right then, give me a moment to look them over, Minerva, and then they're all yours." One by one, the matron went about waving her wand over their foreheads and stomachs and limbs, tutting occasionally, making them stick out their tongues and hop on one foot with their arms out to either side of them all, while Bagman and McGonagall stood and watched in silence. At last, when they had been a clean bill of health, Professor McGonagall stepped forward once more. This time she held her wand in her hand. "I'll begin with you, Miss Granger," she said, and Hermione audibly gulped. "Close your eyes, if you would, and take a nice deep breath, deep as you can." "Good." Professor McGonagall made a very precise-looking gesture with her wand, and then pointed it directly at Hermione's chest. There was a flash of warm yellow light, and Madame Pomfrey stepped up behind Hermione just in time to catch her and gently lower her limp body to the floor. Violet saw that her eyes were closed, and she did appear to be breathing, but very slowly, as if in the deepest throes of sleep. "Now you, Miss Potter," said McGonagall, and it was Violet's turn to gulp. She followed the same instructions, squeezing her eyes shut and sucking in air until her lungs ached. "Harry will find me," she thought fiercely. "Harry will save me. He'll find me. He will." I know he the very next moment, before being able to even finish her thought, Violet found herself breaking the surface of black, frigid water. She was bobbing on the surface of the lake, sunlight streaming down through the clouds overhead, and a loud screeching sound filled the air all around. She twisted in the water, kicking wildly as she tried to get her bearings, and there, bobbing beside her and looking extremely surprised, was Harry. "Romans 6, Harry shouted, breaking into a smile at the sight of her open eyes. "You're all right." "I will be," Violet said, struggling to tread water. She looked to the other body floating beside them and saw the silvery white hair of the little Delacour girl. "Did you save her too?" "Fleur didn't turn up. I couldn't leave her," Harry panted. "She would have been fine," Violet said in exasperation. "They weren't really going to leave us down there." "The song said the song was just to get you riled up about the time limit," said Violet, echoing Ludo Bagman. "Oh, Harry, you've always got to be the hero, don't you?" Harry now looked very annoyed. "Come on," he said shortly. "Help me with her. I don't think she can swim very well." "I can't swim very well," Violet muttered, feeling awfully tired already. Her drenched robes weighed heavily on her and tangled around her limbs, making it very hard to do the rudimentary kicking she knew to keep her own head above water. She and Harry pulled Fleur's sister through the water, back toward the bank where she could now see the judges standing. The shrieking, it turned out, was coming from the 20 or so merpeople that flanked the three of them in the water, escorting them like a sort of honor guard back to the shore. Violet was seized before she could even get her feet under her and dragged onto dry land, suddenly weighed down even further by an extremely thick gray blanket thrown over her shoulders. Tracy, Cass, Hermione, and Crumb were all similarly bundled around her. Tracy smiled at her through chattering teeth. "Gabrielle, Gabrielle, is she alive?" "Is she hurt?" Violet looked around to see Fleur de Lacre, looking quite hysterical, fighting tooth and nail to break free from Madame Maxim's grip. She managed to tear free just as Harry was pulled upright by Bagman and Dumbledore, racing past them and wrapping her arms about her sister. The noise around them was deafening. Violet could see Ron swaying above the crowd, hoisted up on Fred and George's shoulders as they hollered and cheered Harry's name. The unexpected face of Percy Weasley appeared amongst the crowd of judges fussing over Harry with no sign of Mr. Crouch as his assistant. Percy must have been again called to take his place. "Harry, well done," Hermione cried as Harry was brought over and bundled along with the rest of them. "You did it. You found out how all by yourself." "Well," said Harry, who looked rather bashful. But his eyes moved to the judge's table where Karkaroff still sat, watching him, and said loudly, "Yeah, that's right." "You have a water beetle in your hair, Hermione," said Crumb, drawing Hermione's attention away enough for Violet to lean in. "How did you manage to do it?" she whispered to Harry, who shot her an uneasy grin. "Tell you later," he said through his teeth. Dumbledore was crouching at the water's edge, deep in conversation with what seemed to be the chief merperson, who had a wild tangle of reedy hair and fines sprouting from their head. He was making the same sort of screechy noises that merpeople made when they were above water. Clearly, Dumbledore could speak Mermish. Finally, he straightened up, turned to his fellow judges and said, "A conference before we give the marks, I think." The judges went into a huddle. Madame Pomfrey was going down the line, forcing each of them to drink an extremely hot potion that made jets of steam burst from their ears. Fleur and her sister were brought over and given the same treatment, blankets included. Fleur had many cuts on her pretty face and arms, but she didn't seem to care, nor would she allow Madame Pomfrey to clean them. "Look after Gabrielle," she told her, and then she turned to Harry. "You saved her," she said breathlessly, "even though she was not your Ostate." "Yeah," said Harry, who didn't look particularly happy about it. But then Fleur bent down and kissed him twice on each cheek, and his face went as scarlet as the Hogwarts Express. "And you, too," said Fleur, her eyes landing on Violet. "You helped." "Oh," said Violet, who had mostly just tried not to drown. Sort of Fleur swooped down and hugged her tightly before pressing a single kiss to the middle of her forehead, and Violet felt her face go surely just as red as Harry's. Just then, Ludo Bagman's magnified voice boomed out beside them, making them all jump, and causing the crowd in the stands to go very quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached our decision. Merchieftainess Mercus has told us exactly what happened at the bottom of the lake, and we have therefore decided to award marks out of 50 for each of the champions, as follows. Fleur de Lacre, though she demonstrated excellent use of the bubblehead charm, was attacked by Grindelows as she approached her goal and failed to retrieve her hostage. We award her 25 points. Applause from the stands. I deserve 0, said Fleur throatily, shaking her magnificent head. Cassius Warrington, who successfully managed to transfigure himself, was first to return with his hostage, though he returned 1 minute outside of the time limit of an hour. Enormous cheers from the Hogwarts students, none louder than from Slytherin House. Violet turned to look at Cass in wonder. He'd transfigured himself. Into what? We therefore award him 47 points. But if Cass was first to return and was still outside the time limit, then what did that mean for Harry? Victor Crumb used an incomplete form of transfiguration, which was nevertheless effective, and was second to return with his hostage. We award him 40 points. Karkaroff clapped particularly hard, looking very superior. Harry Potter used gillyweed to great effect. Bagman continued. Violet whipped around to stare at her brother in shock. Had Harry been the one to steal the gillyweed out of Professor Snape's office before she got there? He returned last, and well outside the time limit of an hour. However, the Merchieftainess informs us that Mr. Potter was first to reach the hostages, and the delay in his return was due to his determination to return all hostages to safety, not merely his own. Violet beamed broadly at her stupid brother. Most of the judges, and here Bagman gave Karkaroff a very nasty look, feel that this shows moral fiber and merits full marks. However, Mr. Potter's score is 45 points. The crowd erupted once more. That meant Harry was tied with Cass for first place, Violet realized, and threw her arms around Harry in delight. You and your moral fiber, she hollered into his ear above the laughter and applause. Fleur was clapping very hard too, but Crumb didn't look happy at all. He was attempting to engage Hermione again, but she was too busy cheering Harry to listen. Similarly, Cass, who had both of Tracy's arms wrapped around his middle, wore an expression of conflicting pride and exasperation. The third and final task will take place at dusk on the 24th of June, continued Bagman. His voice boomed above the din. The champions will be notified of what is coming precisely 1 month beforehand. Thank you all for your support of the champions. Chapter 24, Hogwarts Heartbreakers. In the aftermath of the second task, one of the only things that people wanted to hear about were the details of what had happened down in the lake, including Violet herself, who had been unconscious for all of it. Cass and Harry were both happy to share their version of the events to anyone who asked, and everybody asked. By the end of the week, Violet was sick to death of hearing about it all, particularly the part where she and the other hostages were described using words like lifeless, corpse-like, and dead weight. I had to drag them both to surface, Harry was fond of telling people, referring to both Violet and Fleur de Lacquer's little sister, Gabrielle. They were so heavy, I didn't know if I was going to make it. The person most excited to hear the tale, unsurprisingly, was Harry's godfather, Sirius Black, though he had to wait a while to hear it in person. In a letter, he explained that after Rita Skeeter stirred up so much trouble during his last visit to Hogwarts, he and Professor Dumbledore had agreed it would be best for him to stay out of the school grounds. This meant that the next time they would be able to see each other was on the next Hogsmeade outing on the second weekend of March. On Friday morning, Harry received another letter making plans to meet with both Sirius and Professor Lupin at the Three Broomsticks, and invited Violet along to join him. This excited Violet greatly. Despite the fact that Lupin was still at Hogwarts, she'd had precious little interaction with him outside of class. He was often unwell for the days before and after the full moon, and even when he was hale, he seemed extremely busy handling coursework. Violet suspected that he was going to great lengths to keep himself out of sight, even if it meant shutting her out, too. The thought of spending time with him, even just getting to chat for a bit in a pub, buoyed her heart. She approached the final lesson of the afternoon double potions with a hopeful spring in her step. She felt considerably less bouncy, however, when greeted by the sight of Malfoy, Crabbe and Goyle huddled outside the classroom door, peering over the shoulders of Pansy Parkinson and Susanna Runcorn. All of them were looking at something Violet couldn't see and sniggering heartily. Millicent Bulstrode, who was leaned against the wall off to the side, refused to meet Violet's eyes as she approached. When the Gryffindors appeared in the corridor behind them, Pansy pointed excitedly around Goyle's broad back. "There they are, there they are," she giggled as Harry came to stand by Violet's side. The knot of Slytherins broke apart, and Violet saw that Pansy had a magazine in her hands, Witch Weekly. The moving picture on the front showed a curly-haired witch who was smiling toothily and pointing at a large sponge cake with her wand. "You might find something to interest you in there, Potter," Pansy said loudly, and she threw the magazine at a very startled Violet. She caught it on pure reflex, just as the dungeon door to open, and Professor Snape beckoned them all inside. Harry appeared at Violet's side, waving Ron and Hermione away as he joined her and Tracy at their table. Once, Snape had turned his back on them to write up the ingredients of today's potion on the blackboard. Violet hastily rifled through the magazine under the desk. At last, in the center pages, she found what she was evidently meant to be looking for. A color photograph of her and Harry, clearly taken when they weren't looking at the camera, headed a short piece titled, "Hogwarts Heartbreakers, a pair of siblings like no other. Perhaps yet their infamy could not spare them from the trials of blooming adolescence," writes Rita Skeeter. Deprived of love since the tragic demise of their parents, the 14-year-old Potter twins have each sought to fill the void of affection with the company of their Hogwarts classmates, to unfortunate effect. Harry thought he had found solace in his steady girlfriend, Muggle-born Hermione Granger. Little did he know that he would shortly be suffering yet another emotional blow in a life already littered with personal loss. Miss Granger, a plain but ambitious girl, seems to have a taste for famous wizards that Harry alone cannot satisfy. Since the arrival at Hogwarts of Victor Crumb, Bulgarian seeker and hero of the last World Quidditch Cup, Miss Granger has been toying with both boys' affections. Crumb, who is openly smitten with the devious Miss Granger, has already invited her to visit him in Bulgaria over the summer holidays, and insists that he has never felt this way about another girl. But Miss Granger is not the only one with an insatiable appetite for attention. Young Violet has amassed a following of love-struck admirers, that vie for her affections. The most devout among them are two much older boys. Quidditch star Fred Weasley, with whom she danced all night at the school's Christmas ball, and Cassius Warrington, son of disgraced historian Randall Warrington, who emphatically insists that his heart has always belonged to her. Sources reveal that she easily keeps the boys wrapped around her little finger with her pretty face, crocodile tears, and generous displays of affection. The young heart is a tender thing, and its whims are not easily kept in check. In the meantime, well-wishers of the Potters must hope that Violet finds a more respectable source of comfort, and that next time Harry will bestow his heart on a worthier candidate. Below the article were two more photographs. One of Harry and Hermione, apparently taken at the end of the second task. Both of them were wrapped in towels, smiling and embracing each other, with Victor Crumb looking decidedly glum in the background. The other photo was of Violet, very happily kissing George in the middle of the three broomsticks. Harry was saying something to her. He was trying to, at least. Violet could hear his voice, coming from very far away, even though he was sat right next to her and holding tightly onto her arm. She couldn't make out a single word he was saying over the roar of blood in her ears, nor could make out his face for the tears that were now falling freely from her eyes. "Got to breathe." The words came to her like an echo, faint and half distorted. "Got you. Right here." Harry was shaking her arm now. Her knuckles bumped against the underside of the desk, which was enough to shock her back into her body. Violet sucked in a sharp gulp of cold dungeon air and had to immediately hold it in, lest it break free from her lips in the form of a sob. "It doesn't matter," Harry said, close and clear now, even through his gritted teeth. "Romans 6, it's just rubbish, and it doesn't matter. Give it here, don't look at that anymore." She felt the magazine being pulled from her grip, freeing her hands to ball into tight fists on her thighs. The feel of her fingernails digging sharply into her palms helped to ground her. Feeling and senses returned to her body. Violet practiced at breathing evenly. She shakily wiped the tears from beneath her eyes. Doing so cleared her vision, but also made her horribly aware of the shape sitting on the other side of her, Tracy, watching her out of the corner of her eye as she unpacked ingredients for a wit-sharpening potion from her bag. But Tracy didn't speak to her. Not to condemn her, but not to comfort her either. They worked side by side in dreadful silence, with Harry quietly muttering assurances once in a while when Violet's hands began to tremble again. All she wanted was to crawl into bed and cry. To run, to hide, to get away from all the eyes she could feel directed her from across the room where Pansy, Malfoy, and the others sat, watching her like vultures, waiting for her to collapse and die from embarrassment. Violet kept it together, breathing and not crying. She would go to pieces later, alone and in private, but not here. Nother. She held on until 10 minutes into the lesson when, under the guise of borrowing more scarab beetles for grinding, Pansy Parkinson got up and walked past Violet's table. She gave a loud cough, which sounded an awful lot like the word slut. Harry stood up so fast his chair shot out behind him, wooden legs screeching loudly on the stone dungeon floor. He looked at Pansy with murder in his eyes, but he'd barely opened his mouth before the shadow of Professor Snape appeared behind him. "Potter, return to your seat," Snape snarled. "Didn't you hear her?" Harry cried, pointing at Pansy. She said she called, "I don't care what was said. My classroom is not your personal playground. Now be seated and be quiet." 10 points from Gryffindor for the disruption. Harry dropped back into his chair with a huff, now glaring daggers at Snape, only to watch in horror as the professor stooped and picked something up from the floor. "Ah!" Reading magazines under the table as well. He straightened up, holding the copy off which weakly in his hand. A further 10 points from Gryffindor. Oh, but of course. Snape's black eyes glittered as they fell on Rita Skeeter's article. The Potters must keep up with their press cuttings. The dungeon rang with laughter from Malfoy's corner, and an unpleasant smile curled Snape's thin mouth. To Violet's mortification, he began to read the article aloud. "Hogwarts Heartbreakers. My, haven't you two been busy? A pair of siblings like no other, perhaps. A low whine had started to build in the back of Violet's mind. The noise reminded her of one of Dudley's Christmas presents, a remote-controlled helicopter, the blades of which had to be warmed up before they were going fast enough to take flight. Above it, she could hear Professor Snape's voice, and the titters of laughter creeping in from all sides of the classroom now, but the whine remained constant, building. She could feel the heat in her face, that terrible blush, and wished desperately for the heat to go elsewhere, to make her shame less visible and obvious. Amassed a following of love-struck admirers, Snape was saying. The magazine burst into flames in his hand. Somebody across the room yelled, "Oh shit," as Professor Snape dropped the flaming magazine, its pages already curling and black as they hit the floor. He put out the blaze with 2 quick stomps of his foot, and then rounded on Harry and Violet. "So," he said softly, his cold gaze flickering back and forth between their pair of shocked faces. "Determined to keep the spotlight on you, I see. Get up, both of you. I'll see to it that you remain front and center that table in front of my desk. Move." Now, trembling with shame and fury, the twins gathered their ingredients into their cauldrons and dragged them up to the front of the dungeon to the empty table. Professor Snape followed, sat down at his desk, and watched the two of them unpack. Determined not to let him see the fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, Violet ducked her head low and resumed the crushing of her scarab beetles, sucking in small, even breaths between her teeth. "All this press attention seems to have inflated your already over-large head, Potter," said Snape quietly, once the rest of the class had settled down again. From his tone, it seemed these words were directed solely at Harry. He was trying to provoke him into another blow-up. He'd done it before. She could already feel the anger radiating from where her brother sat beside her. "You might be laboring under the delusion that the entire wizarding world is impressed with you," Professor Snape went on, so quietly that no one else could hear him. "But I don't care how many times your picture appears in the papers. To me, Potter, you are nothing but a nasty little boy who considers rules to be beneath him." Violet tipped the powdered beetles into her cauldron and started cutting up her ginger roots. She frowned, concentrating very hard on keeping the sharp edge of her blade away from the soft tips of her fingers. Beneath the table where Snape couldn't see, her legs shifted to press against Harry's, trying to ground him the way he'd done for her. "So I give you fair warning, both of you," Snape continued in a softer and more dangerous voice, and Violet froze. "Pint-sized celebrities, or not, if I catch you breaking into my office one more time." "We haven't been anywhere near your office," said Harry angrily, as Violet shrank into her seat beside him. "Don't lie to me," Snape hissed, his chair creaking slightly as he leaned toward them. "Boomslang skin, gillyweed, both come from my private stores, and I know who stole them." Violet made the mistake of glancing up at Professor Snape's face. He and Harry were glaring fiercely at one another, Snape's teeth bared in a silent snarl as her brother boldly held his gaze. In truth, neither of them had stolen those things from Snape's stores. Harry had said the gillyweed during the second task, but he hadn't stolen it. She was the one who'd broken into Professor Snape's office with Thaintontoff, stealing the gillyweed, but found that it was already missing when she got there. Someone else had gotten to it first. The true culprit, as she had come to learn, was Darby the house elf, who had beaten her to it by just minutes and passed it along to Harry just before the task began. The boomslang skin was a genuine mystery to her. "I don't know what you're talking about," Harry said coldly. "You were both out of bed on the night my office was broken into," Snape hissed. Violet noted with relief he didn't say the first time. "I know it, Potter. Now Mad-Eye Moody might have joined your fan club, but I will not tolerate this behavior. Least of all from a member of my own house." Violet paled as he directed a glare at her. "One more nighttime stroll into my office, and you will pay." "Right," said Harry coolly, as though their lives weren't in immediate danger. "We'll bear that in mind if we ever get the urge to go in there." Snape's eyes flashed. He plunged a hand into the inside of his black robes. For one wild moment, Violet thought Professor Snape was about to pull out his wand and curse Harry right there in front of everyone. Then she saw that Snape had drawn out a small crystal bottle of a completely clear potion. They stared at it. "Do you know what this is, Potter?" Professor Snape said, speaking solely to Harry, his eyes glittering dangerously again. "No," said Harry. "It is Veritaserum, a truth potion so powerful that 3 drops would have you spying your innermost secrets for this entire class to hear," said Snape viciously. "Now, the use of this potion is controlled by very strict ministry guidelines. But unless you watch your step, you might just find that my hand slips." He shook the crystal bottle slightly, "right over your evening pumpkin juice. And then, Potter, then we'll find out whether you've been in my office or not." Harry, to his credit, said nothing. He turned back to his ginger roots once more, picked up his knife, and started slicing them again. His and Violet's calves were still pressed firmly together beneath the desk, but even that warmth and stability did little to settle Violet's shattered nerves. Though she doubted very much that Professor Snape would break magical law just to get the two of them in trouble, the mere thought of that truth serum had her repressing a shudder. All the trouble she had gotten into over the years, with Harry and by herself, and all the other people who be implicated the events of last year alone. Their use of Hermione's time turner, if any of that ever came out. Violet had just started to hyperventilate again when there was a knock on the dungeon door. "Enter," said Snape in his usual voice. The class looked around as the door opened. Professor Karkaroff came in. Everyone watched him as he walked up towards Snape's desk. He was twisting his finger around his goatee and looking agitated. "We need to talk," said Karkaroff abruptly when he had reached Professor Snape. He seemed so determined that nobody should hear what he was saying that he was barely opening his lips. It was as though he were a rather poor ventriloquist. Violet held her breath until her chest ached, listening hard. "I'll talk to you after my lesson, Karkaroff," Snape muttered, but Karkaroff interrupted him. "I want to talk now while you can't slip off, Severus. You've been avoiding me." "After the lesson," Snape snapped. Under the pretext of examining the color of the mixture in her cauldron, Violet sneaked a sidelong glace at the pair of them. Karkaroff looked extremely worried, and Snape looked angry. Again, serious words echoed through her mind. "You know what Death Eaters are, don't you?" Karkaroff hovered behind Professor Snape's desk for the rest of the double period. He seemed intent on keeping Snape from slipping away at the end of class. While his presence was discomforting, it did stop Snape from hissing any more threats toward the twins under his breath. With 2 minutes to the bell, Harry kicked Violet lightly under the table. She looked at him as, looking right back at her, he knocked his uncorked bottle of armadillo bile off of the desk, spilling it onto the floor. "Oops," he said, and ducked beneath the desk, nodding for her to join him. "Let me help," Violet said loudly as she slipped out of her chair. Under the guise of mopping up, the two of them stayed hunkered in place while the rest of the class moved noisily toward the door. "What's so urgent?" she heard Snape hiss at Karkaroff. "This," said Karkaroff, and Violet, peering out from beneath the desk, saw Karkaroff pull up the left-hand sleeve of his robe and show Professor Snape something on his inner forearm. "Well," said Karkaroff, still making every effort not to move his lips. "Do you see?" "It's never been this clear, never since—" "Put it away," snarled Snape, his black eyes sweeping the classroom. "But you must have noticed," Karkaroff began in an agitated voice. "We can talk later, Igor," spat Snape. His eyes landed on Harry peeping out from behind his cauldron. "Potter, what are you doing?" "Clearing up my armadillo bile, Professor," said Harry innocently, straightening up and showing Snape the sodden rag he was holding. Violet, whose hands were empty, tucked herself deeper under the cover of the desk. Karkaroff turned on his heel and strode out of the dungeon, looking both worried and angry. When Harry grabbed her hand and dragged out of the classroom behind him, Violet didn't dare risk a backward glance at Professor Snape. "Miss Potter," Snape called sharply when they were nearly out the door. Violet looked back, eyes wide. "Detention. Be in my office tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Violet's heart sank. That was the exact time they were supposed to be meeting with Sirius in Hogsmeade. "Detention!" roared Harry, who had stopped in the threshold to wait for her. "But she didn't do anything." "No," said Snape, eyes glittering coldly at her. "The pile of ash on my floor from your little stunt with the magazine, you call that nothing?" "That's not fair," Harry said, before Violet could even defend herself. And then, instead of saying something useful like, "There's no proof she did it," or "You hallucinated that, sir," he instead blurted out, "She can't help it." Snape's eyes narrowed, and his icy stare, now tinged with a trace of curiosity, bore into her like a drill. Violet looked away sharply, shooting a furious glare at Harry. "Can't she?" she heard Professor Snape say. "Intentional or not detention, 1 o'clock. I won't repeat myself again." Fuming, Violet pushed past Harry and stomped out of the room. She heard the classroom door slam hard enough to rattle in its hinges, followed by the pounding of footsteps behind her. "I can't believe that ugly git giving you detention on a Saturday," Harry said irately as he caught up beside her. "He must have known we're planning to see Sirius. I bet that's why he did it." "Leave me alone," Violet muttered, increasing her pace. Harry looked at her in shock. "What are you mad at me for? You've always got to say something, Harry." "Really, she can't help it." "But you can't," Harry said, frowning at her. "I was standing up for you, Violet." "Well, I didn't ask you to do that," she hissed, rounding on her brother so quickly that he almost ran into her. "Not against Snape. Every time you stand up to him, it just makes him angrier, and then half the time he takes it out on me. If you hadn't jumped up at Pansy like that, then he wouldn't have seen the magazine, and he wouldn't have read that Thatophil article from Thatafoluman. But he saw the pictures, and he read it all right in the middle of class, and now everybody thinks that I'm." Now the tears were coming again. Pansy's cough, the laughter, Snape's mocking voice. She could hear it all bouncing around inside her skull, even louder when she threw her hands over her ears to try and drown it out. A sob escaped Violet's lips before she could stop it. Harry moved toward her with his arms out, as though he meant to wrap her in a hug, but she couldn't bear the thought of being touched, even by him. Without a word, Violet turned and ran, leaving Harry behind as he called after her. She ran and ran, pausing only briefly to gasp the passphrase to the slithering common room before running through it too, straight down into the girls' dormitory where her bed waited to welcome her. She landed face first into her pillow. And in the darkness provided by the heavy curtains that hung around the four-poster, Violet allowed herself to fully break down. At some point, drained of energy by the racking sobs and endless stream of tears pouring out of her face, she must have fallen asleep. Consciousness returned slowly, sluggishly. Her body felt as though it weighed 100,000 tons, and trying to lift her eyelids required Herculean effort. Blinking into the darkness, Violet had just enough awareness to realize that some external force had woken her up. Someone was sitting on her bed. At first she thought it was Crookshanks, but whenever Crookshanks sensed that she'd woken up, he would get up and come stick his squished little face right up next to hers, purring softly. Not only was there no purring, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could see the outline of a shape that was much too large to be her cat. "Hey, Roman 6, said Tracy. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, and to Violet's immense relief, it didn't sound particularly angry. In fact, it didn't sound very emotional at all. Violet didn't respond. She lay still, eyes open, waiting. "You missed dinner," Tracy said, still in that soft, flat voice. "I brought you a couple bread rolls, but you missed a good meal. Lots of gravy and all that." If dinner was over, that meant she'd been in bed for hours. Violet didn't think she could keep anything down, but her stomach gurgled slightly at the mention of bread. She hadn't eaten very much for lunch. The shape of Tracy shifted slightly, but remained quiet for a moment. Violet remained face down and still, breathing slowly. She knew she ought to say something. Tracy knew she was awake and listening, so it wasn't any good to pretend she wasn't. But what was she supposed to say? "George Weasley's been out in the hallway all evening," Tracy said eventually, "trying to get someone to let him into the common room. I told him to go back to Gryffindor Tower, that you'd talk to him when you were ready, but I don't know if he listened. He's really worried about you, though. Another person that Violet needed to talk to, just what her nerves needed. Maybe if she closed her eyes and held her breath, she could fall back asleep again and not wake up until the end of term when everyone had already gone home. Cass is hiding too, you know, Tracy continued, this time with a little laugh. Violet's eyes shot back open. I dunno if he's hiding from you or from me, and I don't suppose it matters, really, since we're both in here now. But seeing as neither of the people I want to talk to most are talking tome, there was a slight edge to her voice now. I suppose I've just got to sit here and talk to myself. So do me a favor and listen, will you? The mattress dipped as Tracy shifted again, turning herself to face Violet's prone and silent form. She paused again, as though waiting for Violet to respond, but she couldn't. She just couldn't. Her tongue was bone dry and felt too large in her mouth, and the thought of rolling over or moving her head made her bones ache in protest. So she lay there until Tracy sighed and said, I know that Cass is in love with you. I've known the whole time, Violet, she continued, even as the blood in Violet's veins turned to ice. He's been into you for years, and I'm not as stupid as you both seem to think I am to not see it. The way he looks at you, the way he talks about you. Honestly, I don't think he ever even tried to hide it. You're the only one who didn't see it, Romans 6, because I know you've never felt the same way about him, despite what that stupid article said. So the only reason I can think of for you to be making such a fuss and acting so weird around me is because that idiot went and told you how he felt, and now you're trying to protect me from it. It was then that Violet remembered, and not for the first time, that Tracy had been sorted into Slytherin House for a reason. She had more cleverness and discerning the traits most valued by Salazar Slytherin himself in her pinky finger than the likes of Draco Malfoy had in his whole pureblood body, and it was just like to her to gear it all towards figuring out her friends. Violet's eyes stung, as though they were trying to well up with tears without having left to cry. She moved, finally. A slow inch at a time, she rolled onto her side to face Tracy in the darkness. He asked, her voice came out horribly weak and cracked. She had to swallow hard to wet her throat and tried again. He asked me to the ball before he asked you, Violet confessed at last. But he did it the same way. Gave you the same speech, I mean. I thought he was just being an arse, trying to make me jealous even though I turned him down, and I wanted to tell you, Tracy, but you were so happy. About being asked to the ball, about all of it. And I knew you'd get hurt either way, but I didn't want to be the one to do it. Violet sucked in a trembling breath. She'd been carrying the guilt around with her for months. To put everything out in the open felt like pulling a knife out of a wound. I figured it was something like that, Tracy said. Violet could just see the shine of her eyes, the soft curves of her face and shoulders. I knew he must have asked you first, that I was the second choice. It's the only thing that made sense. Then why did you say yes? Violet croaked. Tracy chuckled and shook her head. Because I was happy about being asked to the dance. I was happy about it all, getting to dress up and show off and dance with a Hogwarts champion. Because even if I was the second choice, even if it was only 'cause he couldn't have you, he still picked me, you know. And besides, it was pretty clear you were head over heels for George. So I knew you wouldn't, change your mind about Cass all of a sudden. I can't handle all the rest of it, but that would have been too much for me, I think. But why have jousted with him? Asked Violet, pushing herself up onto her elbows. If you knew all this time that it was all a lie, why have you been going along with it, Tracy? I don't think it's all been a lie. Maybe it started that way, with him just pretending, and me just enjoying the attention while it lasted. But, she shrugged, her voice dropping to a murmur. I really do like him, Roman 6. I like him a lot. Tracy moved suddenly, scooting closer up toward the head of the bed as she felt around for Violet's hand. When she found it, she clasped it tightly between both her own. We're all so stupid, aren't we? She was close enough now that she spoke under her breath, her words coming out in a whisper that only the two of them could possibly hear. Me looking at Cass, Cass looking at you looking at me, Violet gasped. It was the first time since their very brief, very awkward encounter the year before, when Violet had kissed her in the Hogsmeade Gardens, that Tracy had made any acknowledgement of Violet's crush on her. Tracy had very gently rejected her, and not a word had been spoken of it since. Violet hadn't told a soul about what she'd done, not even Harry. But before all of this, we made it work somehow, didn't we? We were all just friends, and I really want for us to be that again. Nobody has to be boyfriends or girlfriends or anything else. We can just sit and eat and laugh and do homework and get into trouble together. Do you remember that? I'd give anything to have that back, Violet, because I miss it so much. I just miss my friends. Can we be that again? Do you think? Can we try? Tracy's voice was pleading now, trembling with emotion as she clutched Violet's hand. Violet flung herself upright and wrapped her free arm around Tracy, who immediately embraced her right back. Of course we can, Violet cried, her voice cracking again. Of course we can be that. I miss it too, Trace. I miss you so much, and I miss Cass even though I'm so mad at him. Don't be mad anymore, said Tracy through her tears, which Violet could now feel soaking into her shoulder. Let's just forget about it all and let everything go back to normal, okay? Okay, said Violet wetly. She'd managed to conjure up some fresh tears after all. I'm sorry I lied to you, Tracy. I'm so sorry. Tracy's arm tightened around her, and Violet could feel the other girl's shoulders shaking. I'm sorry too, okay? But we're fine now. Everything's going to be fine. For the very time in a very long while, Violet believed it. She buried her face into her best friend's shoulder and held on for dear life, enjoying the warmth, the softness, the love, which had been off-kilter between them for far too long. And again, at some point, exhausted and emotionally drained from all, Violet and Tracy fell asleep in each other's arms, curled up together like when they were kids. At noon, Violet bid a bitter farewell to all her friends who were setting out for Hogsmeade Village. Harry kept looking back apologetically at her as he went off with Ron and Hermione to meet up with Sirius and Professor Lupin without her, so that Violet had to turn away from the sight of their retreating backs lest she start crying again. The most painful parting was with Tracy. Their late-night conversation had mended a rift that had been growing since the very beginning of the school year, and the two of them desperately wanted to enjoy a day out together now that all the bad air had been cleared away. Cass was not yet part of the equation again. Neither hide nor hair had been seen of him since the night before, but Tracy was confident that once they could all sit down and talk, that everything would be able to go back to normal. Violet didn't quite share that confidence, but it was nice to have the hope. At 1 o'clock sharp, Violet knocked resignedly on the door to Professor Snape's office. Moments later the door opened, and once again Snape's black eyes settled on her. "In," he said shortly. Violet entered, her heart sinking as the heavy door thudded shut behind her. She approached Snape's desk with curiosity. Instead of a bubbling cauldron, an array of ingredients awaiting her, she found a simple wooden bucket, one large glass bowl and two smaller ones, and an assortment of delicate little metal tools that looked like they had seen a lot of use. Peeking into the bucket, Violet let out a gasp of horror. It was filled nearly to the brim with frogs. Small, dead little green and brown bodies piled limply atop one another, sitting in a shallow pool of brine. While Violet had never been particularly squeamish, it made for an unpleasant sight. "Today you will be harvesting frog brains," said Professor Snape as he swept around her to stand behind his desk. "And eyes, if you can manage it. This latest batch of first years has even more dunderheads than usual, and supplies are low." So this was a proper detention after all. Violet had hoped, very faintly, that Snape might provide her with another lesson instead of a punishment. Those hopes were fully extinguished when he began demonstrating the method of getting a frog's brain out of its head in one piece after plucking the eyeballs out of their sockets using a tool that was similar to a pair of tweezers. only instead of pincers it had little spoons on the end for scooping. When the bowls are full, Professor Snape gestured to the two smaller bowls, I will examine your work and determine if it is sufficient or if you are in need of further discipline. Begin. It was rotten work. Not only were the frogs extremely floppy and difficult to get a grip on, they were also wet and cold as ice. The one thing that Violet had not been provided with was a pair of gloves. Her fingers felt thick and frozen in no time at all, and the undersides of her nails were quickly blackened with slime, bile, and blood. The frog's eyes kept splitting and popping when she tried to pluck them out, oozing a filmy grey jelly onto her already slippery hands. After completely destroying 5 eyes in a row, Violet was nearing the verge of tears. Frog brains didn't look anything like what she thought a brain ought to be, either. Instead of something pink and bumpy, they were long and thin and yellow-white, almost translucent in places. To Violet, they almost looked like half-formed frogs themselves, sitting inside the heads of much larger bodies. And while their little bones were very soft, Snape had shown her how to go in through the mouth, where the tissue was thinnest, to extract the brain and its stem in one whole piece. It felt as though an age were crawling by as Violet worked. The office was silent save for the squelch of frog guts and the tiny, infrequent plink of an intact eyeball being dropped into the bowl. Professor Snape was on the other side of the room, rustling papers and occasionally clinking a glass or two together. But without turning her head, Violet couldn't see what he was doing. She was just starting to feel grateful that at least Snape was leaving her alone when she heard the sound of his footsteps approaching behind her. Sloppy work, Potter, he said coldly, observing the mess she had made of yet another frog's eye. It's a wonder you've made it this far in the world, despite your inability to grasp a simple pair of forceps. I'm surprised you ever learned how to write. Violet kept her head down, working. It was even more difficult now that she was being watched. Her left hand gripping the forceps was trembling slightly, and her right hand was so cold she could barely feel it at all. With great effort, she slipped the small metal spoon tips under the frog's eyelids and pinched, gently. Squish. Professor Snape tutted loudly. Did I not state that the eyes must bane-tact, Potter? He snapped over her shoulder, making her tense up so badly she nearly crushed the whole frog in her fist. They're of no use to anyone in that state. Not even the poorest apothecary hack could make do. I believe I told you to harvest the frog, not mangle it. Violet swallowed around the lump of rage and embarrassment that was growing in her throat. This was rapidly shaping up to be just like her last detention with Professor Snape, where the punishment lay not in what she had to do, but in the cruel words she was expected to silently endure. She discarded her ruined frog and picked up another, trying to ignore the feel of Snape looming behind her. This time, she was able to pluck both eyes out whole and pull out the brain in one slimy piece. Don't get too impressed with yourself now, sneered Professor Snape. Even a fool gets lucky once in a while. Shaking, Violet reached for another frog. The first eye plink, into the bowl, the second squish. Perhaps I ought to have set a task more suited to your skill set, Snape said as she stood there shaking, angry tears starting to cloud her vision. Something simpler, like catching the required frogs. Do you understand that Hogwarts must pay for its supplies, or do you imagine it all to grow on trees, and that your waste costs nothing more than my time? Violet's jaw was clenched so tightly her teeth ached. As Snape spoke, her shoulders had hunched themselves further and further, now drawn almost up to her ears with tension. She plunged her hand back into the icy frog bucket, fuming. Are you getting angry, Potter? Said Professor Snape, moving into her field of vision at last. He walked slowly around outside of the desk, watching her. Are you upset? Have I hurt your precious feelings? From his tone, Violet expected him to be sneering. She thought his face would be twisted into the same cruel, satisfied smile he'd worn before, knowing that he had gotten so thoroughly under her skin with his insults and insinuations. But even through her bleary gaze, she could tell that Snape wasn't smiling at all. He was frowning, brows furrowed, as he fixed his dark eyes on her face. "Answer me, Potter. I asked you a question," he snapped sharply. "Are you angry?" "Yes, sir." "At me?" Snape said, his eyes flashing. "Yes, sir," Violet managed to get out from behind her teeth. "And what are you going to do about it this time? Start another fire, shatter a jar or two? I doubt you've the gall to strike at me directly, but I admit it would be interesting to see you try." Violet went very still. Fire, was this about the magazine? "I suspect this isn't the first time you've let your magic get away from you," Professor Snape continued. Violet wondered, as she had often had cause to wonder before, if he was able to read her mind. "Lashing out like an untrained child. Tell me, is it always fires, or do your little tantrums express themselves in other ways?" Violet didn't know if she wanted to answer that. To admit, out loud, and to Professor Snape of all people, that she had lost control. "I've burned stuff before," she found herself saying, as if compelled by Snape's impatient glare. "But only once, sir." "What was it that you burned?" Violet swallowed. "A newspaper, earlier this year." "A newspaper," Snape repeated, sneering. "Dear, dear. Is all the bad press taking its toll? Was the headline not flattering enough for your liking?" Her numb fingers slipped around the handle of the forceps. Squish. Violet took a deep breath, starting to shake again, and Snape said, "What else?" "What else what?" Violet challenged, tossing the frog into the waste bowl with more force than was necessary. "I told you, I haven't set any more fires." Snape put his hands on the desk and leaned toward her, and Violet wished that she could grab the words out of the air and stuff them back inside her mouth. He was going to shout at her now, or hiss more horrible things, until she was a weeping, shivering wreck for daring to speak to him like that. "Here lies Violet Potter," her tombstone would say, couldn't keep her mouth shut. "Put it away, Potter," Snape said in a surprisingly calm voice. Violet hesitated, her hand hovering over the bucket. Surely he wasn't letting her go. "Put what away, sir?" "Your Snape barked. "It won't do you any good here, and it's making you sloppy if you ruin another frog's eye. I'll have you start disemboweling them instead. Now put it away and focus on the task at hand." Frowning, Violet tried to imagine how one could put away an emotion. It wasn't a book or a plate or anything else that could be set neatly out of the way on a shelf. "Bottle it up" was an expression she'd heard, but Violet's anger felt too big to fit inside of a bottle. It would burst if she tried, like a shaken-up fizzy pop. "Tell me about another incident," Snape demanded, mercifully leaning away from her and straightening himself back up. She could feel him staring at her, watching as she struggled to get her emotions in check. "I pushed Malfoy without touching him. On the train during first year," she admitted. "Then, and I shattered a glass that someone else was holding." "Go on." Plink went an eyeball into the bowl. I hurt a snake during the dueling club with Professor Lockhart." "In what way?" "I didn't mean to," Violet said in a small voice. "It was going to hurt someone. I just wanted to stop it from attacking, but the way it moved, I know I hurt it somehow." "But I didn't mean to." "What mean matters little," said Snape coldly. "What's done is done. What else? If a bottle wasn't big enough, maybe a box would do." She pictured herself trying to cram her anger into a cardboard box and quickly sealing up the top with tape so it couldn't get back out again. But then she thought that her anger would be so heavy that if she tried to pick it up and move it, the bottom would fall through and it would all come spilling out again. Plink, "I blew up my aunt." "You, what?" Snape said, sounding genuinely baffled. "Not my real aunt," Violet clarified, trying to keep her hands steady as she pulled the little frog's brain out through its throat. "Our uncle's sister, but we had to call her our aunt." She saw the rather disturbed look on Snape's face and realized her misunderstanding. Blew up like." Violet puffed out her cheeks and held her hands apart as though she were holding a large beach ball. I didn't make her explode, sir." "I see." Snape's expression dropped back into something less startled, though he did raise an eyebrow at her. "And what, dare I ask, did this woman do to earn herself such a fate?" "A no account, good for nothing, lazy scrounger." Violet hadn't thought much about that final night with Aunt Marge. It didn't trouble her mind at all, despite the many problems that came from turning her aunt into a human balloon and running off into the night with her brother to escape punishment. But even now, she could still hear those words echoing in her head. You nasty little liar. Your tart of a sister, a burden on your decent, hard-working relatives. Insolent, ungrateful little. If her anger was too heavy to pick up, then maybe she could put it somewhere that it didn't have to be moved. She could shove it into a closet, or perhaps a cupboard. Plink. She insulted me. Snape gave her a hard look. I've been insulting you for the better part of an hour now, Potter, and I have yet to find myself bouncing off of the ceiling. You didn't say what she said, sir, said Violet quietly. Plink. Though he continued to look at her, Snape mercifully let the matter lie. Any other incidents? He asked, after silently letting her get through another 2 frogs. Violet still could barely feel her fingers, but the fact she wasn't trembling any more made it easier to be delicate. Something less. Destructive, perhaps, Violet thought hard, back to her childhood. All the strange, unexplainable things that used to happen around her and Harry before they learned that they were magic. She thought of Dudley and how he used to pinch her until she bruised, and of Aunt Petunia yanking her hair back with a brush until her scalp felt like it was on fire. She thought of running and hiding at the sound of Uncle Vernon's car pulling into the drive, of squirreling away every coin and dropped toy and piece of candy that she could get her hands on, just to have a little something to enjoy for later. Of the many dark days she and Harry spent together in their tiny cupboard under the stairs, the hours upon hours with hungry bellies and thirsty throats waiting to be let out or to have some leftover scraps tossed their way after dinner. Maybe she wouldn't put her anger into a cupboard after all. Not even her anger deserved that. Plink. I made a glass window disappear at the zoo, Violet said quietly. It sounded to her like her own voice was coming from far away, as though through a thick fog. Dudley pushed me over and it hurt, so I made the glass go away and he fell too. A jar would be a good place to put her anger, she thought idly. One of the great big glass jars with the screw-on hoop lids that were used for pickles and things. It would be heavy, but maybe she could still pick it up or even turn it on its side and roll it if she needed to get it out of the way. And it could probably withstand the pressure of the anger trying to get out. Ange could still see into the jar to check how much anger was actually in there. I ruined a jumper that I didn't want to wear, made it smaller and smaller so that it wouldn't fit over my head anymore until Aunt Petunia changed her mind. She pretended it shrunk in the washing machine, but I knew it was me that did it. Oh, a washing machine is like a box that muggles put their laundry into, and it sort of spins. I am familiar with the intricacies of a washing machine, Potter, Snape snapped. Right, sorry, sir. She blinked and looked up at Professor Snape. You are. His eyes glittered oddly at her. Can you identify a common theme to these outbursts? Snape asked smoothly, ignoring both her question and her wide-eyed stare. Violet turned back to the frog in her hands and frowned. I, I was angry. Something was happening that I didn't like. I want to make it stop. So I did. Squish. The little eye deflated into a mushy pile in her grip. Violet froze, holding her breath as she waited for Snape to berate her latest failure. If she had to start disemboweling the frogs, would he make her dole off them and keep her here until the middle of the night? And did your little display of outrage do anything to resolve the problem before you? Said Snape, his tone notably colder. Or did it not simply create one, for which you had no one to blame but yourself? Violet's eyes started to sting again. She blinked very quickly and tried to picture the jar she decided to put her anger in, but how was she supposed to get it into the jar when it was running through her whole body like a venom? It made it worse, she admitted, avoiding Professor Snape's eyes again. I always make everything worse. Yet you continue to do it, over and over, and learning nothing, Snape snapped. You mistake making an emotional fool of yourself for taking control of the situation, but let me tell you something, Potter. He suddenly slammed his palm down onto the desk, rattling the bowls and making Violet flinch horribly. You are not in control. You are a small, weak little girl with not even the tiniest amount of say in the workings of this world, no matter how unfair or unpleasant they may be to behold. Your tears and your tantrums mean nothing, they solve nothing, other than to throw away what minuscule scrap of power you do have, control over yourself. Do you understand me? Look at me when I'm talking to you. Violet's gaze snapped up, meeting Snape's fathomless black eyes as they bore into face. She was surprised by what she saw there, or rather, what she didn't. Snape's words and tone were harsh, but there was none of the malice or mocking she expected to see in his eyes. Do you understand? Why, yes, sir, Violet stammered. Yes, I understand. She didn't. She didn't understand at all what he wanted, or why he was acting so angry with her, or why he thought it was so important for her to be told how weak and stupid and helpless she was, as if Violet didn't already know all of that. But maybe if she just agreed with him, it would be enough to make him stop. She stood stock still as her heart hammered in her chest. Snape's eyes narrowed coldly, as though knowing she was lying. But instead of calling her on it and tearing her down even further, he said, "Good." Violet watched warily as he straightened up again, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But to her further shock, Snape turned away from her and walked back to the corner of the room he'd been working in previously. She stood frozen, mind and guts churning in confusion, until he called over his shoulder, "Finish with that bucket and clean yourself up, Potter. That will be all for today." The last dozen or so frogs took no time at all to harvest. Even rushing as she was, it took longer to scrub all the gunk out from beneath her fingernails in the basin at the back of the room, running the water so hot that it turned her skin pink and shiny. Professor Snape did not check her work, nor even turn around to dismiss her with more than a wave of his hand when she was through, and Violet rocketed out of his office at last, and took the stairs out of the dungeons two at a time. So eager was she to get away from Snape and his miserable, confounding lectures. It was an hour before supper. Violet could see the late day sun, low in the sky, but still shining brightly through the windows of the entrance hall, where the last stragglers of the Hogsmeade visit were still trickling in. She was very surprised to Tracy and Cassius amongst them, walking together through the great double doors of Hogwarts just as Violet stepped out into the open hall. She was even more surprised to see that they were holding hands. "Violet!" Tracy called as she spotted her standing there. She let go of Cass's hand and skipped toward Violet, hugging her tightly as soon as she was within arm's reach. "We missed you at Hogsmeade, so I got you an extra pack of sugar quills to bring back as a treat." "What have you been up to?" "I told you I had detention," Violet mumbled, watching over Tracy's shoulder as Cass slowly ambled toward them. Tracy's mouth fell open in shock. "Wait, so it was a proper detention? You haven't been down there all day, have you?" "I had to harvest frog eyes," said Violet, "and brains, a whole bucketful of them." Oh no, so Snape was mad. Tracy grimaced sympathetically. She followed Violet's eyes behind her to where Cass was now hovering, hands in his pockets. He had a paper shopping bag from Honeyduke's candy shop hanging from his wrist, and was looking rather nervous. Tracy grabbed him by the elbow and pulled him up beside her. She placed a hand on Violet's shoulder and said, suddenly very serious, "Cass has got something to say to you. And I know you usually like to run away from awkward conversations, but it would mean a lot to me if you would hear him out, Violet." Oh, Violet blinked at her in surprise. "Okay." She looked up into Cass's face, which had gone slightly pink. He glanced at Tracy, who gave him a short, decisive nod of reassurance, and then he began to speak. "I'm sorry," was the very first thing he said. "Tracy told me you two talked last night and what you talked about. Wanting to go back to the way things were, and all that, I mean. And I wanted to say to you that I'm sorry for mucking it all up in the first place. I'm not sorry for asking you to go to the Yule Ball with me." And here the pinkness in his face spread down to his neck as well. "But I am very sorry for how I reacted when you turned me down. It was unkind and unfair to you, and to Tracy, and we had a really long talk about all of that earlier over some butter beers. He glanced back at Tracy, who was smiling, encouraging at him. But I want things to go back to normal too, Romans 6. I miss you like crazy, and watching the two of you being on the outs kept me up at night more than knowing I was going to have to fight a dragon. So again, I'm very, very sorry for being an arse. I've done some personal work and gotten over myself, and I'd really just like to be friends with you again. If you'll have me, and I understand if you won't. But yeah. Violet found herself staring up into Cass's wide, hopeful eyes, and for the first time in a very long while she wasn't angry at him. She saw Tracy shift beside him and glanced down to find that they were holding hands again. "What's that about?" she asked, nodding toward their intertwined fingers. The two of them glanced down and then at each other, smiling. "Right, so that long talk I said we had," started Cass. "Well, it was really long, and we talked a lot, and we sort of figured out we like each other," Tracy cut in bluntly. She was smiling very widely, her plump cheeks dimpled inward as she looked up into Cass's blushing face. "Really, actually like each other a lot, even after everything that's been going on. And we want to try to make it work between us, for real this time." He looked back to Violet, his expression turning apprehensive. "If you're willing to put up with us, I mean." "With me?" Violet looked back and forth between the Cass and Tracy, who had been her two best friends in the world since her very year at Hogwarts, and heaved a heavy sigh. "Of course I'm willing to put up with you, you dolt," she said, as she slung an arm around each of their shoulders and pulled them all together into a hug. Tracy squealed happily and embraced her at once, and Violet felt Cass's shoulders relax under her hand. When she finally let go, they stepped back, all three of them now beaming at each other. "Oh, here, almost forgot," said Cass. He held out his arm and passed Violet the Honeydukes bag 2 boxes of lime-flavored sugar quills. Looked back at her, along with a stack of chocolate frogs. "The frogs are from me, since I know you like the cards," he said, "and the quills are from Tracy." "Because lime are your favorite," Tracy said brightly. Violet, who honestly never wanted to look at or think about frogs ever again, grinned at them both, suddenly feeling happier than she ever had in her whole life.